The inn where Nikolai Levin was dying was one of those establishments which are found in governmental cities, built on a new and improved model, with the very best regard for neatness, comfort, and even elegance, but which the public frequenting them cause to degenerate with extraordinary rapidity into filthy grog shops, with pretensions to modern improvements, and by some reason of this very pretentiousness become far worse than old-fashioned inns which are simply filthy. The inn had already reached this condition. The soldier in dirty uniform, who served as Swiss and was smoking a cigarette in the vestibule, the perforated cast-iron staircase, gloomy and unpleasant, the impertinent waiter in dirty black coat, the common hall with its table decorated with a dusty bouquet of wax flowers, the dirt, dust, and slovenliness everywhere, and at the same time a certain new restlessness and self-sufficiency characteristic of these railway days. Everything about this inn produced a feeling of deep depression in the Levins after their recent happiness, and especially from the fact that the wretched condition of the inn was wholly irreconcilable with what was waiting for them. As usual, after they had been asked what priced rooms they wanted, it proved that the best rooms were taken, one by the supervisor of the railroad, another by a lawyer from Moscow, the third by Princess Astavyeva from the country. One disorderly bedroom was left for them, with the promise that they should have the one next to it when evening came. Levin took his wife to it, vexed to find his prognostications so speedily realized, and impatient because when his heart was overwhelmed with emotion at the thought of how he should find his brother, he was obliged to get settled instead of hurrying to his brother. "Go, go," said Kitty, with a melancholy look of contrition. He left her without saying a word, and just outside the door he ran against Marya Nikolaevna, who had just heard of his arrival, but had not ventured to knock at his room. She had not changed since he last saw her in Moscow. She wore the same woolen dress, without collar or cuffs, and her pock-marked face expressed the same unfailing good nature. "Well, how is he? Tell me." "Very bad. He doesn't sit up, and he is all the time asking for you. She... Is your wife with you?" Levin at first did not see why she seemed confused, but she immediately explained herself. "I am going to the kitchen," she went on to say. "He will be glad. He remembers seeing her abroad." Levin perceived that she meant his wife, and did not know what to say. "Come," he said, "let us go to him." But they had not gone a step before the chamber door opened and Kitty appeared. Levin grew red with vexation and mortification to see his wife in such a predicament. But Marya Nikolaevna was still more confused, and crouching back against the wall ready to cry, she caught the ends of her apron and wound it around her red hands, not knowing what to say or to do. For an instant Levin saw an expression of lively curiosity in the look with which Kitty regarded this terrible creature, so incomprehensible to her. It lasted but a moment. "Tell me, what is it? How is he?" she asked, turning to her husband, and then to the woman. "We cannot talk in the corridor," replied Levin, looking with an expression of annoyance at a gentleman who, with leisurely steps, as if on his own business bent, was coming along the corridor just at this time. "Well, come into the room then," said Kitty, addressing the apologetic Marya Nikolaevna. Then, seeing the look of alarm on her husband's face, she added, "Or rather go and send for me," and she turned back to the room. Levin hastened to his brother. He had never expected to see and experience what he now saw and experienced. He expected to find him in that state of illusion so common to consumptives, and which had so struck him during his visit the preceding autumn. He had expected to find him with the physical indications of approaching death more distinct than before, greater feebleness, greater emaciation, but practically about the same state of things. He expected that he should have the same feeling of pity for this well-beloved brother, and a horror of that presence of death, only intensified. He was quite prepared for this, but what he saw was absolutely different. In a little, close, dirty, ill-smelling room, the panelled walls of which were covered with red stains of expectoration, separated by a thin partition from another room, where conversation was going on, he saw lying on a wretched bed moved out from the wall a body covered with a counterpane. One hand huge as a rake, and holding in a strange way by the end of a sort of long and slender bobbin, was on the outer side of the counterpane. The head, resting on the pillow, showed the thin hair glued to his temples, and a strained, almost transparent brow. "Can it be that this horrible body is my brother Nikolai?" thought Levin. But as he came near, he saw his face, and the doubt ceased. In spite of the terrible change that had taken place, it was enough to glance at the lively eyes turned toward him as he entered, or the motions of his mouth under the long moustache, to recognize the frightful truth that this dead body was indeed his living brother. Nikolai's gleaming eyes gazed at his brother with a stern and reproachful look. His look seemed to bring living relations between living beings. Konstantin instantly felt the reproach in the eyes fixed on him, and regret for his own happiness. When Konstantin took his brother's hand, Nikolai smiled, but the smile was slight, almost imperceptible, and in spite of it the stern expression of his eyes did not change. "You did not expect to find me so," said he, with effort. "Yes. No," replied Levin with confusion. "Why didn't you let me know sooner, before my marriage? I had inquiries made for you everywhere." He wanted to keep on speaking, so as to avoid a painful silence, but he did not know what to say, the more as his brother looked at him without replying, and seemed to be weighing each one of his words. Finally he told him that his wife had come with him, and Nikolai appeared delighted, adding, however, that he was afraid he should frighten her by his condition. A silence followed. Suddenly Nikolai began to speak, and Levin felt by the expression of his face that he had something of importance to tell him. But he spoke only of his health. He blamed his doctor, and regretted that he could not have consulted a celebrity in Moscow, and Levin perceived that he was still hopeful. Taking advantage of the first moment of silence, Levin got up, wishing to escape for a little while at least from these cruel impressions, and said that he would go and fetch his wife. "Good. I will have things put in order here. It is dirty here and smells bad, I imagine. Masha, you attend to this," said the sick man with effort. "Yes. And when you have put things to rights, go away," he added, looking at his brother questioningly. Levin made no reply, but as soon as he had reached the corridor he paused. He had promised to bring his wife, but now as he recalled what he himself had suffered, he made up his mind to persuade her that she had best not make this visit. "Why torment her as I am tormented?" he asked himself. "Well, how is it?" asked Kitty with a frightened face. "Oh, it is horrible, horrible. Why did you come?" Kitty looked timidly, compassionately at her husband for a few seconds without speaking. Then going to him, she put both hands on his arm. "Kostya, take me to him. It will be easier for both of us. Take me and leave me with him, please. Can't you see that it is far harder for me to see you and not to see him? Perhaps I shall be useful to him, and to you also. I beg of you, let me go." She besought him as if the happiness of her life depended on it. Levin was obliged to let her go with him, but in his haste he completely forgot all about Marya Nikolaevna. Kitty, walking lightly and showing her husband a courageous and sympathetic face, stepped quietly into the sick man's room and shut the door noiselessly. She went with light, quick steps up to the bed and sat down so that the sick man would not have to turn his head, and with her cool, soft hand she took the dying man's enormous bony hand, pressed it, and employing that tact peculiar to women of showing sympathy without wounding, she began to speak to him with a gentle cheerfulness. "We saw each other at Soden without becoming acquainted. You did not think then that I should ever become your sister." "You would not have known me, would you?" he said. His face was lighted up with a smile when he saw her come in. "Oh, yes, indeed. How good it was of you to send for us. Not a day has passed without Kostya speaking of you. He has been very anxious about you." But the sick man's animation lasted only a short time. Kitty had not finished speaking before his face again assumed that expression of stern, reproachful envy which the dying feel for the living. "I'm afraid that you are not very comfortable here," said she, avoiding the look which he gave her, and examining the room. "We must ask for another room, and be nearer to him," she said to her husband. Levin could not bear to look at his brother, could not even be himself and feel at ease in his presence. When he came into the sick man's room, his eyes and his motions entirely absorbed him, and he did not see and did not realize the details of the frightful situation. He perceived the horrid odor. He saw the uncleanliness and disorder. He heard the sick man's groans, and it seemed to him that there was no way of helping it. It did not occur to him to investigate how the body lay under the coverlid, how the lean, long legs, the thighs, the back, were doubled up and accommodated. Nor did he ask whether he might not help him lie more easily and do something to improve his condition, at least to make a bad situation less trying. The mere thought of these details made a cold chill run down his back. He was undoubtedly persuaded in his own mind that it was impossible to do anything either to prolong his life or to lighten his sufferings, and the sick man, feeling instinctively that his brother was powerless to help him, was irritated. And this made it all the harder for Levin. To be in the sick room was painful to him. To be away from it was still worse. And he kept leaving the room under various pretexts and coming back again, for he was unable to stay alone by himself. Kitty thought, felt, and acted in an entirely different way. As soon as she saw the sick man she was filled with pity for him, and this pity in her womanly heart, instead of arousing a sense of fear or repulsion as it did in her husband's case, moved her to act, moved her to find out all the details of his condition and to ameliorate them. And as she had not the slightest doubt that it was her duty to help him, neither did she doubt the possibility of it, and she set herself to work without delay. The details the mere thought of which repelled her husband were the very ones that attracted her attention. She sent for a doctor. She sent to the drugstore. She set her own maid and Marya Nikolaevna to sweeping, washing, and dusting, and she even helped them herself. She had all needless articles carried away, and she had them replaced by things that were needed. She went several times to her room, paying no heed to those whom she met on the way, and she unpacked and carried with her sheets, pillowcases, towels, shirts. The waiter who served the table d'hôte dinner to the engineers several times came with a surly face when she rang, but she gave her orders and with such gentle authority that he never failed to execute them. Levin did not approve of all this. He did not believe that any advantage would result from it for the sick man. More than all, he was afraid that it would worry his brother. But Nikolai, although he seemed to be indifferent, did not lose his temper, and only felt a little ashamed, and watched with a certain interest everything she did for him. When Levin came back from the doctor's, whither Kitty had sent him, he saw, on opening the door, that under Kitty's directions they were changing the sick man's linen. His long white back and his stooping shoulders, his prominent ribs and vertebrae, were all uncovered, while Marya Nikolaevna and the lackey were in great perplexity over the sleeves of Nikolai's nightshirt, into which they were vainly striving to get his long thin arms. Kitty, quickly closing the door behind Levin, did not look at him, but the sick man groaned and she hastened to him. "Be quick," she said. "There, don't come near me," muttered the sick man angrily. "I myself—" "What do you say?" asked Marya, but Kitty had heard and understood that he was ashamed of being stripped in her presence. "I am not looking, she said, trying to get his arm into the nightshirt. "Marya Nikolaevna, you go to the other side of the bed and help us. Please go and get a little flask out of my bag, and bring it to me," she said to her husband. "You know, in the side pocket. Please bring it, and in the meantime we will finish arranging him." When Levin came back with the flask, he found the invalid lying down in bed, and everything about him had assumed a different appearance. The oppressive odor had been exchanged for that of aromatic vinegar which Kitty, pursing up her lips and puffing out her rosy cheeks, was scattering about from a glass tube. The dust was all gone. A rug was spread under the bed. On the table were arranged the medicine vials, a carafe, the necessary linen, and Kitty's English embroidery. On another table, near the bed, stood a candle, his medicine, and powders. The sick man, bathed, with smoothly brushed hair, was lying between clean sheets, and propped up by several pillows, was dressed in a clean nightshirt, the white collar of which came around his unnaturally thin neck. A new expression of hope shone in his eyes as he looked at Kitty. The doctor whom Levin went for and found at the club was not the one who had been treating Nikolai and had aroused his indignation. The new doctor brought his stethoscope and carefully sounded the sick man's lungs, shook his head, wrote a prescription, and gave explicit directions first about the application of his remedies and then about the diet which he wished him to observe. He ordered fresh eggs, raw, or at least scarcely cooked, and seltzer water with milk heated to a certain temperature. After he was gone, the sick man said a few words to his brother, but Levin heard only the last words, "Your Katya." But by the way he looked at Kitty, Levin knew that he had said something in her praise. Then he called Katya, as he had named her. "I feel much better already," he said to her. "With you I should have gotten well long ago. How good everything is." He took her hand and lifted it to his lips, but as if he feared that it might be unpleasant to her, he hesitated, put it down again, and only caressed it. Kitty pressed his hand affectionately between her own. "Now turn me over on the left side, and all of you go to bed." No one heard what he said. Kitty alone understood. She understood because she was ceaselessly on the watch for what he needed. "Turn him on the other side," she said to her husband. "He always sleeps on that side. Is it not pleasant to call the man? I cannot do it. Can you?" she asked of Marya Nikolaevna. "I am afraid not." Levin, as terrible as it was to put his arms around this frightful body, to feel what he did not wish to feel under the coverlid, submitted to his wife's influence, and assuming that resolute air which she knew so well, and putting in his arms, took hold of him, but in spite of all his strength he was amazed at the strange weight of these emaciated limbs. While he was, with difficulty, changing his brother's position, Nikolai threw his arms around his neck, and Kitty quickly turned the pillows so as to make the bed more comfortable, and carefully arranged his head and his thin hair, which was again sticking to his temples. Nikolai kept one of his brother's hands in his. Levin felt that the sick man was going to do something with his hand and was drawing it toward him. His heart sank within him. Yes, Nikolai put it to his lips and kissed it. Then, shaken with sobs, Levin hurried from the room without being able to utter a word. "He has hidden it from the wise and revealed it unto children and fools." Thus thought Levin about his wife as he was talking with her a little while later. He did not mean to compare himself to a wise man in thus quoting the gospel. He did not call himself wise, but he could not help feeling that he was more intellectual than his wife and Agafya Mikhailovna, that he employed all the powers of his soul when he thought about death. He knew also that many great and manly minds whose thoughts on this subject he had read had tried to fathom this mystery, but they had not seemed to know 1/100th part as much as his wife and his old nurse. Agafya Mikhailovna, and Katya, as his brother called her, and he also now began to take pleasure in doing, had, in this respect, a perfect sympathy, though otherwise they were entirely opposite. Both unquestionably knew what life meant and what death meant, and though they were of course incapable of answering or understanding the questions that presented themselves to Levin's mind, they not only had their own way of explaining these great facts of human existence, but they also shared their belief in this regard with millions of human beings. As a proof of their well-grounded knowledge of what death was, they without a second of doubt knew what to do for those who were dying, and felt no fear of them. While Levin and others, who could talk much about death, evidently knew nothing about it because they were afraid of it, and actually had no notion what to do when men were dying. If Konstantin Levin had been alone now with his brother Nikolai, he would have gazed with terror into his face, and with growing terror awaited his end with fear, and been able to think of nothing to do for him. What was more, he did not know what to say, how to look, how to walk. To speak of indifferent things seemed unworthy, impossible. To speak of melancholy things, of death, was likewise impossible. To be silent was even worse. "If I look at him, he will think I am studying him, I fear. If I do not look at him, he will believe that my thoughts are elsewhere. To walk on tiptoe irritates him. To walk as usual seems brutal." Kitty apparently did not think about herself, and she had not the time. Occupied only with the invalid, she seemed to have a clear idea of what to do, and she succeeded in her endeavor. She related the circumstances of their marriage. She told about herself. She smiled on him. She caressed him. She cited cases of extraordinary cures, and it was all delightful. She understood how to do it. The proof that her activity, and Agafya Mikhailovna's, was not instinctive, was animal, was above reason, lay in the fact that neither of them was satisfied with offering physical solace or performing purely material acts. Both of them demanded for the dying man something more important than physical care, something above and beyond merely physical conditions. Agafya Mikhailovna, speaking of the old servant who had lately passed away, said, "Thank God, he had confession and extreme unction. God grant us all to die likewise." Katya, though she was busy with her care of the linen, the medicines, and the bed-sores, even on the first day succeeded in persuading her brother-in-law to receive the sacrament. When Levin at the end of the day returned from the sick-room to their own 2 rooms, he sat down with bowed head, confused, not knowing what to do, unable to think of eating his supper, of arranging for the night, of doing anything at all. He could not even talk with his wife. He felt ashamed of himself. But Kitty showed extraordinary activity. She had supper brought. She herself unpacked the trunks, helped arrange the beds, and even remembered to scatter Persian powder upon them. She felt the same excitement and quickness of thought which men of genius show on the eve of battle, or at those serious and critical moments in their lives, those moments when, if ever, a man shows his value, and all the preceding days of his life are only the preparation for these moments. The whole work made such rapid progress that before 12 o'clock all their things were neatly and carefully arranged. Their 2 hotel rooms presented a thoroughly homelike appearance. The beds were remade, the brushes, the combs, the hand mirrors were taken out, the towels were in order. Levin found it unpardonable in himself to eat, to sleep, even to speak, and he felt that every motion he made was inappropriate. But she took out her toilet articles and did everything in such a way that there was nothing in the least disturbing or unsuitable in it. Neither of them could eat, however, and they sat long before they could make up their minds to go to bed. "I am very glad that I persuaded him to receive extreme unction tomorrow," said Kitty, as she combed her soft perfumed hair before her mirror, sitting in her dressing-sack. "I never saw it given, but Mamma told me that they repeat prayers for restoration to health." "Do you believe that he can get well?" asked Levin, as he watched the narrow parting at the back of her little round head disappear as she moved the comb forward. "I asked the doctor. He says that he cannot live more than 3 days. But what does he know about it? I am glad that I persuaded him," she said, looking at her husband from behind her hair. "All things are possible," she added, with that peculiar, almost crafty expression which came over her face when she spoke about religion. Never, since the conversation that they had had while they were engaged, had they spoken about religion. But Kitty still continued to go to church and to say her prayers with the calm conviction that she was fulfilling a duty. Notwithstanding the confession which her husband had felt impelled to make, she firmly believed that he was a good Christian, perhaps even better than herself, and that all he had said about it was only one of his absurd masculine freaks, such as he liked to indulge in, just as he did when he jested about her border anglaise, as if good people mended holes, but she purposely created them. "There, this woman, Marya Nikolaevna, would never have been able to persuade him," said Levin, "and I must confess that I'm very, very glad that you came. You made everything look so neat and comfortable." He took her hand, but did not kiss it. It seemed to him a profanation even to kiss her hand in the presence of death, but he pressed it as he looked with contrition into her shining eyes. "You would have suffered too terribly all alone," she said, as she raised her arms, which covered the glow of satisfaction that made her cheeks red, and began to coil up her hair and fasten it to the top of her head. "No, she would not have known how. But fortunately I learned many things at Soden." "Were there people there as ill as he is?" "Yes, more so." "It is terrible to me not to see him as he used to be when he was young. You can't imagine what a handsome fellow he was, but I did not understand him then." Indeed, I believe you. I feel that we should have been friends," said she, and she turned toward her husband, frightened at what she had said, and the tears shone in her eyes. "Yes, would have been," he said mournfully. "He is one of those men of whom you can say with reason that he was not meant for this world." "Meanwhile, we must not forget that we have many days ahead of us. It is time to go to bed," said Kitty, consulting her tiny watch. Death. On the next morning communion was administered to the sick man. Nikolai prayed fervently during the ceremony. There was such an expression of passionate entreaty and prayer in his great eyes gazing at the sacred image placed on a card table covered with a colored towel, that it was terrible for Levin to look at him so. for he knew that this passionate entreaty and hope made it all the harder for him to part from life, to which he clung so desperately. He knew his brother and the trend of his thoughts. He knew that his skepticism did not arise from the fact that it was easier for him to live without a religion, but from the fact that gradually his religious beliefs had been supplanted by the theories of modern science, and therefore he knew that his return to faith was not logical or normal, but was ephemeral and due simply to his unreasonable hope for recovery. He knew likewise that Kitty had strengthened this hope by her stories of extraordinary cures. Levin knew all this, and was tormented by these thoughts as he looked at his brother's beseeching, hopeful eyes, as he saw his difficulty in lifting his emaciated hand to touch his yellow forehead to make the sign of the cross, and saw his fleshless shoulders and his hollow rattling chest, unable to contain the life which he was begging to have restored. During the sacrament, Levin did what he had done 1,000 times, skeptic that he was. "Heal this man, if thou dost exist," he said, addressing God, "and thou wilt save me also." The invalid felt suddenly much better after the anointing with the holy oil. For more than an hour he did not cough once. He assured Kitty, as he kissed her hand with smiles and tears of thanksgiving, that he felt well, that he was not suffering, and that he felt a return of strength and appetite. When his broth was brought, he got up by himself and asked for a cutlet. Hopeless as his case was, impossible as his recovery was, as any one might see by a glance, Levin and Kitty spent this hour in a kind of timid joy. "Is he not better?" "Much better." "It is astonishing." "Why should it be astonishing?" "He is certainly better," they whispered, smiling at each other. The illusion did not last. The sick man went serenely to sleep, but after half an hour his cough wakened him, and instantly those who were with him, and the sick man himself, lost all hope. The actuality of suffering unquestioned made them forget their late hopes. Nikolai, giving no thought to what he had believed a half hour previously, and apparently ashamed even to remember it, asked for a bottle of iodine to inhale. Levin gave him the bottle, which was covered with a piece of perforated paper, and his brother looked at him with the same imploring, passionate look which he had given the image, as if asking him to confirm the words of the doctor, who attributed miraculous virtues to the inhaling of iodine. "Kitty isn't here?" he asked in his hoarse whisper, when Levin had unwillingly repeated the doctor's words. "No." "Then I may speak. I played the comedy for her sake. She is so sweet. But you and I cannot deceive ourselves. This is what I put my faith in," said he, pressing the bottle in his bony hands as he smelt the iodine. About 8 o'clock in the evening Levin and his wife were taking tea in their room, when Marya Nikolaevna came running toward them all out of breath. She was pale, and her lips trembled. "He is dying," she whispered. "I am afraid that he is dying." Both of them hurried to Nikolai. He had lifted himself and was sitting up in bed, leaning on his elbow, his head bowed, his long back bent. "How do you feel?" asked Levin tenderly, after a moment of silence. "I feel that I am going," whispered Nikolai, struggling painfully to speak, but as yet pronouncing the words distinctly. He did not raise his head, but only turned his eyes up, without seeing his brother's face. "Katya, go away," he whispered once again. Levin sprang up, and in an imperative whisper bade her to leave the room. "I am going," the dying man whispered once again. "Why do you think so?" asked Levin, for the sake of saying something. "Because I am going," he repeated, as if he had an affection for the phrase. "It is the end." Marya Nikolaevna came to him. "If you would lie down, it will be easier for you," said she. "Soon I shall be lying down," he remarked softly. "Dead," he added with angry irony. "Well, lay me back, if you will." Levin laid his brother down on his back, took a seat near him, and, hardly able to breathe, gazed into his face. The dying man lay with his eyes shut, but the muscles of his forehead twitched from time to time as if he were in deep thought. Levin involuntarily tried to comprehend what was taking place in him, but in spite of all the efforts of his mind to accompany his brother's thoughts, he saw by the expression of his calm stern face, and the play of the muscles above his eyebrows, that his brother perceived mysteries hidden from him. Yes. Yes. So, the dying man murmured slowly, with long pauses. Lay me down. Then long silence followed. So, he said suddenly, with an expression of content, as if all had been explained for him. "O Lord," he exclaimed, and he sighed heavily. Marya Nikolaevna felt of his feet. "They are growing cold," she said in a low voice. Long, very long, as it seemed to Levin, the sick man remained motionless, but he was still alive, and sighed from time to time. Weary from the mental strain, Levin felt that in spite of all his efforts he could not understand what his brother meant to express by the exclamation "so." He seemed to be far away from the dying man. He could no longer think of the mystery of death. The most incongruous ideas came into his mind. He asked himself what he was going to do. To close his eyes, dress him, order the coffin. Strange, he felt perfectly cold and indifferent. He did not experience any sense of grief or loss, or even the least pity for his brother. The principal feeling that he had was one almost of envy for the knowledge which the dying man would soon have, and which he himself could not have. Long he waited by his bedside, expecting the end. It did not come. The door opened, and Kitty came in. He got up to stop her, but instantly heard the dying man move. "Don't go away," said Nikolai, stretching out his hand. Levin took it, and angrily motioned his wife away. Still holding the dying man's hand, he waited a half hour, an hour, and still another hour. He ceased to think of death. He thought what Kitty was doing. Who was occupying the next room? Had the doctor a house of his own? Then he became hungry and sleepy. He gently let go the dying man's hand, and felt of his feet. His feet and legs were cold, but still Nikolai was breathing. Levin started to go away on his tiptoes, but again the invalid stirred and said, "Don't go away." It began to grow light. The situation was unchanged. Levin gently rose, and without looking at his brother went to his room and fell asleep. When he awoke, instead of hearing of his brother's death as he expected, he was told that he had come to his senses again. He was sitting up in bed, was coughing, and wanted something to eat. He became talkative, but ceased to talk about death, and once more began to express the hope of getting well again, and was more irritable and restless than before. No one, not even his brother or Kitty, could calm him. He was angry with them all, and said disagreeable things, and blamed everyone for his suffering, demanded that the famous doctor from Moscow should be sent for, and whenever they asked him how he was, he replied with expressions of anger and reproach. "I am suffering terrible, unendurable agony." He suffered more and more, especially from his bed sores, which they were wholly unable to heal, and his irritability kept increasing, and he reproached them all bitterly, especially because they did not fetch the doctor from Moscow. Kitty tried every means in her power to help him, to calm him, but it was all in vain, and Levin saw that she was suffering physically as well as morally, although she would not confess it. The sentiment of death which had been aroused in all by his farewell to life that night when he had summoned his brother was mightily weakened. All knew that he would inevitably and speedily reach the end, that he was already half dead. They all felt that the sooner he died the better it would be, yet, concealing this, they still gave him medicines from vials, sent for new medicines and doctors, and they deceived him and themselves and one another. All this was falsehood, vile, humiliating, blasphemous falsehood. And this falsehood was more painful to Konstantin than to the others, because he loved his brother more deeply, and because nothing was more contrary to his nature than lack of sincerity. Levin, who had long felt the desire to reconcile his two brothers before Nikolai should die, wrote to Sergey Ivanovitch. He replied, and Konstantin read the letter to the sick man. Sergey Ivanovitch could not come, but he asked his brother's pardon in touching terms. Nikolai said nothing. "What shall I write him?" asked Konstantin. "I hope you are not angry with him." "No, not at all," replied Nikolai, in a tone of vexation. Write him to send me the doctor." 3 cruel days passed in this manner, the invalid remaining in the same condition. All those who saw him, the hotel waiter and the landlord and all the lodgers, and the doctor and Marya Nikolaevna, and Levin and Kitty, now wished only one thing, and that was his death. The invalid only did not express any such wish, but, on the contrary, continually grumbled because they did not send for the doctor, and he took his remedies, and he spoke of life. Only at rare moments, when opium caused him for a little to be oblivious of his incessant agony, he would in a sort of doze confess what weighed on his mind even more heavily than the others. "Oh, if this could only end, or when this is over." His sufferings, growing ever more and more severe, did their work and prepared him to die. There was no position in which he could find relief. There was not a moment in which he could forget himself. There was not a place or a single member of his body that did not cause him pain, agony. Even the memories, the impressions, and the thoughts about his body now awakened in him the same feeling of repulsion as his body itself. The sight of other people and their talk, their individual recollections, were a torment to him. Those who surrounded him felt it and instinctively refrained in his presence from using any freedom of motion, from conversation or expressing their wishes. All his life was concentrated in one feeling, suffering, and in an ardent desire to be freed from it. Evidently there was accomplishing in him that revolution whereby he would be induced to look on death as a consummation of his desires, even as a joy. Hitherto every individual desire called forth by suffering or privation, as by hunger, weariness, thirst, was satisfied by some bodily exercise producing pleasure. But now privation and suffering got no relief, and any attempt at relieving them caused new suffering. And so all his desires were concentrated on one thing, the wish to be delivered from all his woes, and the very source of his woes, from his body. But he had no words to express this thought, and he continued out of habit to ask for what once gave him comfort, but could no longer satisfy him. "Turn me on the other side," he would say, and then immediately wished to return to his former position. "Give me bouillon. Take it away. Speak, and don't stay so still." And as soon as anyone began to speak, he would shut his eyes and show fatigue, indifference, and disgust. On the 10th day after their arrival, Kitty was taken ill. She had a headache and nausea, and all the morning felt unable to get up. The doctor declared that it was caused by her emotions and weariness. He advised quiet and rest. Yet after dinner she got up and went as usual with her work to Nikolai's room. He looked at her sternly and smiled scornfully when she told him that she had been ill. All day long he had never ceased to cough and to groan piteously. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Worse," he replied with difficulty. "I am in pain." "Where do you feel the pain?" "All over." "You will see. The end will come today," said Marya Nikolaevna in an undertone. Levin hushed her, thinking that his brother, whose ear was very acute, might hear. He turned and looked at him. Nikolai had heard, but the words made no impression. His look remained as before, reproachful and intense. "What makes you think so?" asked Levin, when she followed him into the corridor. "He has begun to pick with his fingers." "What do you mean?" "This way," she said, plucking at the folds of her woolen dress. Levin himself noticed that all that day the invalid had been plucking at his bedclothes, as if to pick off something. Marya Nikolaevna's prediction came true. Toward evening Nikolai had not strength enough to lift his arms, and his motionless eyes assumed an expression of concentrated attention. Even when his brother and Kitty bent over him in order that he might see them, this look remained unchanged. Kitty had the priest summoned to say the prayers for the dying. While the priest was reading the prayer, the dying man gave no sign of life. His eyes were closed. Levin, Kitty, and Marya Nikolaevna were standing by his bedside. Before the prayers were ended, Nikolai stretched himself a little, sighed, and opened his eyes. The priest, having finished the prayer, placed the crucifix on his icy brow, then put it under his stole, and after he had stood for a moment or two longer, silently he touched the huge, bloodless hand. It is all over," he said at last, and started to go away. But suddenly Nikolai's lips trembled slightly, and from the depths of his breast came these words, which sounded distinctly in the silent room. "Not yet. Soon." A moment later his face brightened, a smile came to his lips, and the women who had been summoned hastened to lay out the body. The sight of his brother and the propinquity of death awakened in Levin's mind that feeling of horror at the inexplicability and the unavoidableness of death, just as he had felt on that autumn night when his brother came to see him. This feeling was now more intense than ever. More than ever he felt his inability to fathom this mystery, and even more terrible seemed to him its proximity. But now, thanks to his wife's presence, this feeling did not lead him to despair, for in spite of his terrors, he felt the need of living and loving. He felt that love saved him from despair, and that this love became all the stronger and purer because it was threatened. And scarcely had this mystery of death taken place before his eyes, ere he found himself face to face with another miracle of love and of life equally unfathomable. The doctor confirmed his surmise in regard to Kitty. Her discomfort was the beginning of pregnancy. As soon as Alexey Alexandrovitch had learned from Betsy and Stepan Arkadyevitch that all that was expected of him was that he should leave his wife in peace and not trouble her with his presence, and that his wife herself wished this, he had felt himself in too great perplexity to be able to decide anything for himself, and he did not know what he wanted. But, having placed his fate in the hands of others, who were willing enough to occupy themselves with his affairs, he was ready to accept whatever might be proposed to him. Only when Anna had taken her departure, and when the English governess sent to inquire if she should dine with him or by herself, did he for the first time clearly realize his position and its full horror. The hardest element in this state of affairs was that he could not coordinate and reconcile his past with the present. Nor was it the past, when he lived happily with his wife, that disturbed him. The transition from that past to the knowledge of his wife's infidelity he had borne like a martyr. That state of things was trying, but it was incomprehensible to him. If at the time when his wife had confessed her wrong to him she had left him, he would have been mortified and unhappy, but he would not have been in that inextricable, incomprehensible position in which he now felt that he was. He could never now reconcile his present position, his reconciliation, his love for his sick wife and the alien child, with the present state of things. In other words, with the fact that as a reward for all his sacrifices, he was now deserted, disgraced, useful to no one, and a ridiculous laughing-stock to all. The first 2 days after his wife's departure Alexey Alexandrovitch received petitioners and his chief secretary, attended committee meetings, and ate his meals in the dining-room as usual. Without trying to explain to himself why he did this, he directed all the powers of his mind to one single aim, to seem calm and indifferent. As he answered the questions of the servants in regard to what should be done about Anna's rooms and her things, he made superhuman efforts to assume the manner of a man for whom the event that had occurred was not unexpected, and had nothing in it outside the range of ordinary, everyday events, and he accomplished his purpose. No one would have detected in him any sign of despair. But on the second day after her departure, Kornei handed him a milliner's bill which Anna had neglected to pay, and told him that the manager of the business himself was waiting. Alexey Alexandrovitch had the man shown in. "Excuse me, Your Excellency," said the manager, "for venturing to disturb you, but if you order us to apply to her ladyship personally, you will kindly give us her address?" Alexey Alexandrovitch seemed to the manager to be cogitating. Then suddenly turning round, he sat down at the table. Dropping his head into his hands, he sat there a long time in that position. He tried several times to speak, but still hesitated. Kornei, understanding his baron's feelings, asked the manager to come another time. When he was left alone again, Alexey Alexandrovitch realized that he no longer had the power to keep up the rôle of firmness and serenity. He gave orders to send away the carriage which was waiting for him, and he declined to see callers, and would accept no invitations out to dine. He felt that he could not endure the disdain and derision which he clearly read on the face of this manager and of Kornei, and of all without exception whom he had met during these 2 days. He felt that he could not defend himself from the detestation of people, because this detestation did not arise from the fact that he had himself committed any wrong action, for in that case he might have hoped to regain the esteem of the world by improvement in his conduct, but from the fact that he was unhappy, and with an unhappiness that was odious and shameful. He knew that it was precisely for the reason that his heart was torn that they would be pitiless to him. It seemed to him that his fellow men persecuted him as dogs torture to death some poor cur maimed and howling with pain. He knew that the only safety from men was to conceal his wounds from them, and he had instinctively tried for 2 days to do so. But now he felt that he no longer had the strength to continue the unequal struggle. His despair was made deeper by the knowledge that he was absolutely alone in his suffering. In all Petersburg there was not one man to whom he could confide all his wretchedness, not one who would have any pity for him now, not as a lofty functionary, or even as a member of society, but simply as a human being in despair. He had no such friend. Alexey Alexandrovitch had lost his mother when he was 10 years old. He had no remembrance of his father. He and his one brother were left orphans with a very small inheritance. Their uncle Karenin, a man of influence, held in high esteem by the late emperor, took charge of their bringing up. After a successful course at the gymnasium and the university, Alexey Alexandrovitch, through his uncle's aid, made a brilliant start in official life, and, full of ambition, devoted himself exclusively to his career. He formed no ties of intimacy either in the gymnasium or in the university, or afterward in society. His brother alone was dear to him, but he entered the Department of Foreign Affairs, went abroad to live, and died soon after Alexey Alexandrovitch's marriage. While Karenin was governor of one of the provinces, Anna's aunt, a wealthy lady of the governmental capital, introduced her niece to this governor, who was young for such a position, if not in years, and she forced him to the alternative of proposing marriage or leaving the city. Alexey Alexandrovitch long hesitated. There seemed as many reasons in favor of this step as there were opposed to it. There was no definite reason which should impel him to break his rule, when in doubt, don't. But Anna's aunt sent word to him through a friend that he had compromised the young lady, and that as a man of honor he must offer her his hand. He offered himself, and gave her, first as his betrothed and afterward as his wife, all the affection which was in his power to show. This attachment prevented him from feeling the need of any other intimacy. And now out of all the number of his acquaintances he had not one confidential friend. He had many so-called friends, but no intimates. There were many persons whom Alexey Alexandrovitch could invite to dinner, or ask favors of, in the interest of his public capacity, or protection for some petitioner, with whom he could freely criticize the actions of other people and of the highest officers of government. But his relations to these people were exclusively confined to this official domain, from which it was impossible to escape. There was one university comrade with whom he had kept up an intimacy in after years, and to whom he would have confided his private sorrows, but his friend was a trustee of the classical educational institutes in a distant province. Of all the people in Petersburg, the nearest and most practicable acquaintances were his director of the chancellery and his doctor. Mikhail Vasilyevich Sludin, manager of affairs, was a simple, good, intelligent, and well-bred man, and he seemed full of sympathy for Karenin, but 5 years' association in official service put a barrier between them which silenced confidences. Alexey Alexandrovitch, having signed the papers which he brought, sat in silence for some time looking at Sludin, and kept trying, but found it impossible to open his heart to him. The question, "Have you heard of my misfortune?" was on his lips, but it ended in his saying as usual when he dismissed him, "You will have the goodness to prepare me this work." The doctor was another man who was well disposed to him, but between them there had long been a tacit understanding that they were both full of business and in a hurry. Alexey Alexandrovitch did not think at all about his women friends, or even the chiefest among them, the Countess Lidia Ivanovna. Women simply as women were strange and repulsive to him. Alexey Alexandrovitch forgot the Countess Lidia Ivanovna, but she did not forget him. She reached his house at his darkest moment of solitary despair, and made her way to his library without waiting to be announced. She found him still sitting in the same position, with his head between his hands. "J'ai forcé la consigne," she said as she came in with rapid steps, breathless with emotion and agitation. "I know all, Alexey Alexandrovitch, my friend," and she pressed his hand between both of hers, and looked at him with her beautiful, melancholy eyes. Alexey Alexandrovitch, with a frown, arose, and, having withdrawn his hand, offered her a chair. "I beg you to sit down. I am not receiving because I am suffering, Countess," he said, and his lips quivered. "My friend," repeated the Countess, without taking her eyes from him, and suddenly she lifted her eyebrows so that they formed a triangle on her forehead, and this grimace made her ugly yellow face still uglier than before. Alexey Alexandrovitch felt that she pitied him and was on the point of crying. A wave of feeling overwhelmed him. He seized her fat hand and kissed it. "My friend," she said again, in a voice breaking with emotion, "you must not give yourself up to grief. Your grief is great, but you must find consolation." "I am wounded. I am killed. I am no longer a man," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, letting go the Countess's hand, but still looking into her eyes swimming with tears. "My situation is all the more unbearable because I can find neither in myself nor outside of myself any help toward endurance of it." "You will find this help, not in me, though I beg you to believe in my friendship," said she with a sigh. "Our help is love, the love which he has given for an inheritance. His yoke is easy," she continued, with the exalted look that Alexey Alexandrovitch knew so well. "He will sustain you and will aid you." Although these words were the expression of an emotion aroused by their lofty feelings, as well as the symbolical language characteristic of a new mystical exaltation just introduced into Petersburg, and which seemed extravagant to Alexey Alexandrovitch, nevertheless he found it pleasant at the present time to hear them. "I am weak. I am humiliated. I foresaw nothing of this. And now I cannot understand it." "My friend," repeated Lidia Ivanovna. "I do not mourn so much my loss," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, "but I cannot help a feeling of shame for the situation in which I am placed before the world. It is bad, and I cannot bear it." "Is it not you who have performed this noble act of forgiveness which has filled me, and all, with admiration? It is he dwelling in your heart. So, too, you have no cause for shame," said the Countess, ecstatically raising her eyes. Alexey Alexandrovitch frowned, and pressing his hands together, he began to make his knuckles crack. "You must know all the details," he said in his shrill voice. "Man's powers are limited, Countess, and I have reached the limit of mine. All this day I have wasted in details, domestic details, arising," he accented the word, "from my new, lonely situation. The servants, the governess, the accounts. This is a slow fire devouring me, and I have not the strength to endure it. Yesterday I scarcely was able to get through dinner. I cannot endure to have my son look at me. He did not ask me any questions, but I know he wanted to ask me, and I could not endure his look. He was afraid to look at me, but that is a mere trifle." Karenina wanted to speak of the bill that had been brought him, but his voice trembled, and he stopped. This bill on blue paper, for a hat and ribbons, was a recollection that made him pity himself. "I understand, my friend," said the Countess Lidia Ivanovna. "I understand it all. Aid and consolation you will not find in me, but I have come to help you if I can. If I could free you from these petty annoying tasks. I think that a woman's word, a woman's hand are needed. Will you let me help you?" Alexey Alexandrovitch was silent, and pressed her hand gratefully. "We will look after Seroza together. I am not strong in practical affairs, but I can get used to them. And I will be your ekonomka. Do not thank me, I do not do it of myself." "I cannot help being grateful." "But, my friend, do not yield to the sentiment of which you spoke a moment ago. How can you be ashamed of what is the highest degree of Christian perfection? He who humbles himself shall be exalted. And you cannot thank me. Thank him. Pray to him for help. In him alone we can find peace, consolation, salvation, and love." She raised her eyes to heaven and began to pray, as Alexey Alexandrovitch could see by her silence. Alexey Alexandrovitch listened to her, and this phraseology, which before seemed not unpleasant to him, but extravagant, now seemed natural and soothing. He did not approve of this new ecstatic mysticism. He was a sincere believer, and religion interested him principally in its relation to politics, and the new doctrine which arrogated to itself certain new terms, for the very reason that it opened the door to controversy and analysis, had aroused his antipathy from principle. Hitherto he had taken a cold, and even hostile, attitude to this new doctrine, and had never discussed it with the countess, who was carried away by it, but had resolutely met her challenge with silence. But now, for the first time, he let her speak without hindrance, and even found a secret pleasure in her words. "I am very, very grateful to you, both for your words and for your sympathy," he said when she had ended her prayer. Again the countess pressed her friend's hand with both of hers. "Now I am going to set to work," said she, with a smile, wiping away the traces of tears on her face. "I am going to Seroza, and I shall not trouble you except in serious difficulties." And she got up and went out. The Countess Lidia Ivanovna went to Seroza's room, and, while she bathed the scared little fellow's cheeks with her tears, she told him that his father was a saint and his mother was dead. The countess fulfilled her promise. She actually took charge of the details of Alexey Alexandrovitch's house, but she exaggerated in no respect when she declared that she was not strong in practical affairs. It was necessary to modify all her arrangements, since it was impossible to carry them out, and they were modified by Kornei, Alexey Alexandrovitch's valet, who, without anyone noticing it, gradually took it on himself to manage the whole establishment, and calmly and discreetly reported to his baron, while the latter was dressing, such things as seemed best. But, nevertheless, the countess's help was to the highest degree useful to him. Her affection and esteem were a moral support to him, and, as it gave her great consolation to think, she almost succeeded in converting him to Christianity. In other words, she changed him from an indifferent and lukewarm believer into a fervent and genuine partisan of that new method of explaining the Christian doctrine which shortly after came into vogue in Petersburg. It was easy for Alexey Alexandrovitch to put his faith in this exegesis. Alexey Alexandrovitch, as well as the countess and all those who shared their views, was not gifted with great imagination, or at least that faculty of the mind by which the illusions of the imagination have sufficient conformity with reality to cause their acceptation. Thus he saw no impossibility or unlikelihood in death existing for unbelievers and not for him. That because he held a complete and unquestioning faith, judged in his own way, his soul was already free from sin, and that even in this world he might look upon his safety as assured. It is true, Alexey Alexandrovitch dimly felt the frivolity, the fallacy of this presentation of his faith. He knew that when, without a thought that his forgiveness of his wife was the act of a higher power, he gave himself up to this immediate feeling, he experienced a greater happiness than when, as now, he constantly thought that Christ dwelt in his soul, and that by signing certain papers he was following his will. But it was indispensable for Alexey Alexandrovitch to think so. It was so indispensable to have, in his present humiliation, this elevation, imaginary though it was, from which he, whom everyone despised, could look down on others, that he clung to it as if his salvation depended on it. The Countess Lidia Ivanovna had been married when she was a very young and enthusiastic girl to a very wealthy, aristocratic, good-natured, and dissolute young fellow. 2 months after the wedding her husband deserted her. He had replied to her effusive expressions of love with scorn and even hatred, which no one who knew the count's kindliness, and were not acquainted with the faults of Lydia's romantic nature, could comprehend. Since then, without any formal divorce, they had lived apart, and when the husband met his wife, he always treated her with a venomous scorn, the reason for which it puzzled people to understand. The Countess Lidia Ivanovna had long ago ceased to worship her husband, but at no time had she ceased to be in love with some one. Not seldom she was in love with several at once, men and women indiscriminately. She had been in love with almost every one of any prominence. Thus she had lost her heart to each of the new princes and princesses who married into the imperial family. Then she had been in love with a metropolitan, a vicar, and a priest. Then she had been in love with a journalist, 3 Savophiles, and Komisarov. Then with a foreign minister, a doctor, an English missionary, and finally Karenin. These multifarious love affairs and their different phases of warmth or coldness in no wise hindered her from keeping up the most complicated relations both with the court and society. But from the day when Karenin was touched by misfortune, she took him under her special protection. From the time when she began to busy herself with his domestic affairs and work for his well-being, she felt that all her former passions were of no account, but that now she loved Karenin alone with perfect sincerity. The feeling which she cherished toward him seemed to her stronger than all the previous feelings. As she analyzed her sentiment and compared it with the former ones, she clearly saw that she would never have been in love with Komisarov if he had not saved the Emperor's life, or with Ristich Kuzitsky had there been no Slav question. But Karenin she loved for himself, for his great, unappreciated spirit, for his character, for the delightful sound of his voice, his deliberate intonations, his weary eyes, and his soft white hands with their swollen veins. Not only did the thought of seeing him fill her with joy, but it seemed to her that she saw on her friend's face the signs of the impression which she made on him. She did her best to please him, no less by her person than by her conversation. Never before had she spent so much time and attention on her toilet. More than once she found herself wondering what would happen if she were not married and he were only free. When he came into the room, she colored with emotion, and she could not restrain a smile of ecstasy if he said something pleasant to her. For several days the countess had been in a state of great excitement. She knew that Anna and Vronsky were back in Petersburg. It was necessary to save Alexey Alexandrovitch from seeing her. It was necessary to save him even from the tormenting knowledge that this wretched woman was living in the same town with him, and he might meet her at any instant. Lidia Ivanovna made inquiries through acquaintances so as to discover the plans of these repulsive people, as she called Anna and Vronsky, and she tried to direct all of Karenin's movements so that he might not meet them. The young aide to the Emperor, a friend of Vronsky's, from whom she learned about them, and who was hoping through Countess Lidia Ivanovna's influence to get a concession, told her that they were completing their arrangements and expected to depart on the following day. Lidia Ivanovna was beginning to breathe freely once more, when on the next morning she received a note, the handwriting of which she recognized with terror. It was Anna Karenina's handwriting. The envelope was of paper thick as bark. The oblong sheet of yellow paper was adorned with an immense monogram. The note exhaled a delicious perfume. Who brought it? A messenger from the hotel. The countess waited long before she had the courage to sit down and read it. Her emotion almost brought on an attack of asthma, to which she was subject. At last, when she felt calmer, she opened the following note written in French. Madame la Comtesse, the Christian sentiments filling your heart prompt me, with unpardonable boldness, I fear, to address you. I am unhappy at being separated from my son, and I ask you to do me the favor of letting me see him once more before I depart. If I do not make direct application to Alexey Alexandrovitch, it is because I do not wish to give this generous-hearted man the pain of thinking of me. Knowing your friendship for him, I felt that you would understand me. Will you have Seroza sent to me here, or do you prefer that I should come at an appointed hour? Or would you let me know how and at what place I could see him? You cannot imagine my desire to see my child again, and consequently you cannot comprehend the extent of my gratefulness for the assistance that you can render me in these circumstances. Anna. Everything about this note exasperated the Countess Lidia Ivanovna. Its tenor, the allusions to Karenin's magnanimity, the especially free and easy tone which pervaded it. Say that there is no reply, said the Countess Lidia Ivanovna, and, hurriedly opening her bouvard, she wrote to Alexey Alexandrovitch that she hoped to meet him about 1 o'clock at the birthday reception at the palace. I must consult with you in regard to a sad and serious affair. We will decide at the palace when I can see you. The best plan would be at my house, where I will have your tea ready. It is absolutely necessary. He imposes the cross, but he gives also the strength," she added, that she might somewhat prepare him. The Countess Lidia Ivanovna wrote Alexey Alexandrovitch 2 or 3 times a day. She liked this way of communication with him, as it had the elegance and mystery which were lacking in ordinary personal intercourse.